So I said I was going to talk to you a little bit about manual settings on your camera, and I know that this is kind of advanced information at this point, but I just want you to kind of tuck it into your brain and start thinking about it, maybe start researching it. I'll tell you honestly that when I started photography, all of this just went right over my head. I was just, there's math, and I just kind of give up when there's math. So anyway, so I'm just going to run through this article with you. I'm like right behind a camera. And point out some of the really, the important vocabulary that you need to start thinking about. So this is, supposedly a little cheat sheet, but it's still kind of complex, I feel. However, it is a good explanation. So, manual photography. First of all, let me just show you an image. Make that smaller. Everybody wants to get in the view. Okay, so this is the dial on a digital single lens reflex camera, which they call a DSLR, and I have a Nikon. And so manual mode, you get to set both your aperture and your shutter speed. So that's what's so special about manual mode. You really get all that control. And we'll talk a little bit more about aperture and shutter speed in a minute. And then this is just the same deal really on a Canon, except the A has got the old school aperture priority. I can't remember why it's AV. I remember I looked that up once. And then TV, it's time value. Time value, aperture value, time value, and shutter speed are the same thing. And then program is if you just want to change like one thing, which I really never ever use. But all of these three settings right here are really, really important, and you're going to love them. Okay, so there's that. And then we'll talk a little bit about this picture before we get into a little more detail. So this picture is just amazing. If I had had this when I first started photography, I might have understood some of it. So what your aperture is, it's like I call it the window when I teach younger children, the window in your lens. And so it's got these little, what are they called? I can't remember. It's a shutter, almost like, a shutter opens and closes, except it kind of wraps around and opens up more like this. So it gets smaller and bigger. It's got these little plates that can make the window to the inside of your camera smaller to larger. And the effect that has is, obviously, if the window is bigger, it's going to let in more light, but also up above we see the corresponding what happens to the subject. So here with a little tiny window, a little tiny aperture, you can see clearly throughout the scene. But as you can imagine, you're going to need a lot of light to make that scene work. If it's not bright, then you might have some trouble taking a picture, getting an exposure. So, but over here, and this is one of my favorite things in the world. When I discovered this, I was just like over the moon. So when you have a really large aperture, you focus in on your subject, but the background will be blurred. And then you get that beautiful, what they call bokeh, everything is just kind of blurred. Dots of light become like little spheres, transparent spheres. It's gorgeous. Okay, so that's aperture. And then these little things underneath, those numbers, God only knows why they gave them those numbers, but they did. And those numbers are called f-stops. So f1.4 is a really big aperture or a really large window. And f32, weirdly, is a really small window and a small aperture, but the number is bigger. So it's kind of like a play of opposites. But this is a great visual. And then shutter speed, that's how quickly, you know, the shutters on your window open and close. Okay? If your shutter speed is really fast, like 1/1000th of a second, then you're going to get a really, really sharp subject. However, when you get down to slow shutter speeds, like this is half of a second, and they can go slower and slower and slower and slower, faster and faster and faster, depending on the functions of your camera. But that is going to create a blur, but it's really for only a moving subject. So if you don't have a moving subject, the really cool thing about having a slow shutter speed is not only is it going to let time pass while the shutter is open, but it's going to allow more light, more time for light to come in. So that's how they get those amazing like night photography of like the galaxy. They can let the shutter open for, you know, 30 minutes, and it has enough time to capture enough light and detail to get those things at night. So shutter speed is about motion, but everything really in photography is about light. So again, about light. And then down here, ISO. ISO is something a lot of new photographers, they try to use a really high ISO because it will allow you to gather more detail. However, the image gets really spotty, and they call this noise. It gets all these little dots, specks on it, and pretty much, you know, any photographer who knows what they're looking at is going to look at it and say, oh, you had your ISO too high. It's got a lot of noise. And it's sad when you get a great image and, you know, you can't fix ISO. So ISO is the sensitivity to light. And this used to be about how much sensitivity the piece of film had in the camera. So you had different film with different sensitivity. And now it's really just about light again, but it's about the digital sensors in your camera and how much sensitivity to light they have. So you might make the rookie mistake of going with a really high ISO, but it's not going to work out for you unless you're just trying to do something creative. You know, it's always good to experiment. I am pretty firm about just staying down the low end. I keep mine always ISO 100, and then I don't have to mess around. I don't have to get that little bit of noise. Yeah, but of course, you know, experiment for sure. So, and then this arrow down here, these choices down at this end, the small aperture, the fast shutter speed, the low ISO, you need a lot of light to make them work. So it has to be a sunny, bright day, or you've got to add light to it, maybe with an external light like a flashlight, or, you know, photographers have all kinds of extra lights that they bring when they get into equipment, but none of that is necessary. And then at the other end, you've got this huge open window, like imagine a bay window letting light into your camera, and a really slow shutter speed and a really high ISO. You only need a little tiny bit of light to make those things work. So it's like a spectrum. All of these things are like a spectrum. Okay, so enough of that. Let's look a little bit into this article. So first, oddly, I think, it talks about ISO, which I think is like, I don't know. I feel like, you know, just set it to 100 and forget it. But, yeah, you might have a completely different opinion, so always experiment. And then next, aperture. And then here it kind of shows the little blades in the aperture and how they close. You know, The aperture is very similar to your iris, and the opening is like the pupil in your eye. So you're letting in less light when it's bright, more light when it's dim, things like that. But the thing to really remember about aperture is the cool things you can do with it. You're going to get focus on things that are close only, you know, whatever you focus on. And here you would get focus on things that are completely throughout the image, all the way into the distance. So this kind of a really high aperture setting, or small aperture setting, people use different terms. It is great for landscapes if you want to get everything, all the detail in the scene. And then this huge aperture down here, so like a low aperture, you're going to get just what's right in front of you, but make sure you're focusing on it, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But if you actually have a camera, you just want to press that button in soft, like halfway, and get the camera to automatically focus. And you might need to try a couple times to get it to focus on what you want, but once you've got that focus, you're locked and you can take the picture. So the button that takes the picture, that's called the shutter release. Pretty cool, right? So these little shutters open and close. Alright, and then shutter speed. This is all about your creative choice. Of course, it has to do with light as well, like we said, but do you want to get that blur of motion? You know, like imagine lights on a speeding vehicle, you know. You've seen pictures like that shooting down the highway. Or a comet or a shooting star, you know, making a streak of light. That was done with a slower shutter speed. So this is actually 30 seconds when it has that little dot dot. I think that'd be inches, but so, and then this is 1 full second. This is a 1/25 of a second, 1/4 of a second. So so that's what all those numbers mean. You go faster, you're going to get a sharper subject. You go slower, you're going to get a blur. But again, it's about the light. So say you want to get a blurred image in a bright situation. Not going to work out. You're going to get too much light and it's just going to wash out, and you know, you'll get like white. But it's still super fun to experiment. So if you wanted to get, say you wanted to get that blur, like I was saying, it's going to work out better for you when it's not so bright. Just saying. But, you know, like these three things work together in harmony. So it's really just an experiment of what kind of thing, what kind of look are you going for? And you're really going to have to experiment with setting mainly aperture, which is the F numbers, and the size of the window, and shutter speed, which is the speed that these shutters are opening and closing. You know, if it's super fast, you're going to get sharp, but a little light. If it's slow, you're going to get that blur of time passing. So I hope you see the difference. And they talk about white balance, which is about the color of, imagine a white background. And if you have a really warm white balance, it's going to look more yellow or orange. If you have a really cool white balance, it's going to look more blue or green, if that makes sense. So it's like just like you learned in art when you were a kid. Cool colors are a cool temperature. Warm colors are a warm temperature. This is kind of important for portraits especially, because you don't want people looking green or blue, or maybe you do, I don't know. People just look better if their skin tone is warm, you know, like think of peachy pinks and, you know, golden tones. But that one is not as important. I often just set it to auto, and you can also correct it in when you're editing. Okay, so those are the really important things. Just one final point here. So if you do have a camera and you want to try the not just manual where you're setting everything, you want to try just shutter priority, that means that you're worried about movement. Okay, so I'm shooting this game, you know, like a football game, and people are moving really fast, and I just want to capture the person that's, you know, throwing the touchdown. Or I'm terrible at sports, but my husband puts up with me. But so then something like that, shutter speed would be your priority. So you could try that, and then it'll set the aperture that it feels, the camera feels matches, you know, to make it a good exposure of light. And then aperture priority would be when you're worried about what's going to be clear, you know. Do you want just the subject to be clear and the background to be blurry? Do you want it to be clear throughout? Are you worried about adding more or less light, you know? So that's another one you can experiment with. And you set the aperture, that's your priority, and then the camera will pick a corresponding shutter speed for you. So those are actually, I know a newspaper photographer that says he uses those all the time. He really never uses all the settings, but we want to learn about all of them. Okay, and down here it gets into a little bit of compositional guidelines, and we're going to learn so much more about that. So don't worry about that. And then these are just great times to shoot. And sorry about all the ads. But I'll share this article with you, and I hope you enjoyed the video.